I am the director of the Institute of Ethics, Law, and Public Policy, and we have a really interesting topic. And first off, I really want to thank my four colleagues here for giving us the most valuable thing they have right now, and that's time to help put this presentation together. What we're going to do with this process is a little bit different. You've all got those papers in front of you. We'd like you to fill them out, if you haven't already, what you think makes America great. Okay? We'd like to start the dialogue at that point. While I'm going to collect those and I'm going to input them here, and then we're going to get a chart up here and we're going to see what our students think makes America great after the presentation by my colleagues, okay? So that's going to be our focus. It is, and then what we want to do is we want to create that dialogue, and that's what's important, is to create the dialogue, and so that's what we're going to do. Before we get started, there's one thing I want to give a plug for, and it is, we're going to have a speaker this Monday, Colonel Stephen Miska. He's a retired colonel. He's going to talk about leadership and how you have to develop that, whether you're in the business community, government, or politics. What are the tools that you need to start working on now to develop your leadership style? Because really your future success is going to depend on your leadership abilities. So I want to mention that it's going to be up at the Youth Center, and it's going to be from 1 to 3 this coming Monday, and we've got pizza. So if you want to come on up there, and I promise you that's going to be interesting, okay? So pizza. Patty's got it for us, so just... That might resonate. Pizza, good. Okay, so I can't wait to get started. I've really been excited about this forum for quite a while because as a professor here, I'm always fascinated by what my students come up with. And so if you would, please pass forward those papers now, maybe over to the right side here, and I'll collect them. And what I'd like to do is tell you how this topic came about. And it was a personal topic of mine. The last 3 years, I have spent a good deal of time in Italy. I've spent about 6 weeks each summer there in Italy. And I've met some interesting people. I'd like to kind of share their experiences and put that in front of you before we get started. The first gentleman I talked to had graduated from college. He was about 31, 32, and it was a small college in Rome, and he said, you know, there were 28 people in my class, and today, 10 years later, I'm the only one that has a job. Everybody else is just kind of doing day work or trying to just get by. I'm the only one that's been able to get a job, and he's been 10 years out of college. Then I spoke to another young Italian lady, and she told me, she said, yes, I work 2 jobs, cleaning rooms in a hotel. I work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I said, you don't get any time off? She says, I can't afford that. You're working 7 days a week and you can't afford to take time off? And she says, no, I don't have a car. All I've got is a place to live and and I have enough money for food. And then the third person I met that I thought was fascinating was a refugee that had left Afghanistan and he went to Iran. So you can imagine how bad Afghanistan was. And then from Iran, he went up to Norway. And he was able to keep papers in place for 8 years, but then they have a limit, and he was told to leave Norway, and he came to Rome because he had no other place to go. And the fourth gentleman I want to talk to you about was a gentleman that was a refugee from Gambia. Gambia is a West African nation. And he said, so I said, how do you get to Rome? He said, well, one night they knocked on my door, and my friend said, the police are looking for you to kill you. And he said, what'd I do? And his friends told him, he said, you were seen with the wrong people. And so at that point, he went into his bedroom, he's packed his clothes, and he left Gambia. And the only way to get out of Gambia is you got to get across the Sahara Desert. So he basically trekked across the Sahara Desert. He got rides. It took him about 6 weeks, he said. He got into a couple of small towns, and he was able to get himself to northern Africa. Then he had to take a boat into Italy. So I've got these experiences myself that I'm hearing over here on this side, and then I get this slogan, Make America Great Again. And the two just don't connect for me. So that's what was really kind of the putting this topic together. That's where I wanted to start it with. And what we're going to do, if I'm going to pick up these papers, I'm going to be inputting your perceptions and your thoughts while our panel talks, and then when our panel is finished, hopefully I'll have got the numbers and we can see what you think makes America great, and we can begin to dialogue on that, okay? So that's the thought. So with that, I'll turn it over to my friend Chris Vakey. He is the department chair for philosophy. He's going to start us off.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for being here today at the forum. So, the title of our forum is "What Makes America Great," and so I want to make a few preliminary comments. Essentially, what I see myself as doing is opening up the time for a conversation to kind of put the question on the table is what I see myself as doing here. Okay, so in that spirit, we as a nation have recently come through an election cycle in which the candidate who ended up winning, Donald Trump, used the campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," with an exclamation point at the end, right? "Make America Great Again," exclamation point, okay? As in, we will, or I will, make America great again, I think, as an election slogan, right? Or let's make America great again, or we need to make America great again. I think something like that, right? So in this forum today, we want to open up a conversation about what it is specifically that makes America great, or that would make America great. Because in that slogan, nothing is said about that, of course, right? The slogan itself doesn't tell us anything. Like most campaign slogans for any party, it's vague and non-specific, just enough to hook us, but of course doesn't touch anything someone might disagree with. Because you could lose some votes if you do that, of course, right? So, they completely non-specific, as they almost always are. It really says nothing, next to nothing in itself, okay? But we hope today to use it as a stimulus to get us to think about this, about what it is that makes America great, or what that might be, right? So let's think for a moment about this term "great," right? It's one of those words that everybody wants to be great, and if somebody connects the word "great" with something you care about, like your society, your nation, it's kind of like, yeah, great, but it's not saying much of anything, right? So, but let me say this: to say that something is great, it would seem to imply that it is, we're saying the thing is distinguished in a positive way, and perhaps even noble. Even more generally, it is to say that that thing is good or valued, okay? But the thing is, we don't call things good or valued unless there are some specific characteristics that make that thing good or valued, that constitute its goodness or its value. World Series, he's a great ball player, right? I mean, take your pick, whoever you want to talk about. Yeah. But of course, we would never say that unless that particular player is a sparkling defender, fundamental base runner, a good hitter, right? And if you call him or her great, of course it's him in Major League Baseball, you're saying that these things are good to an elevated degree. But there's specific things, right? Specific things that make specific good things related to baseball that can be the basis for calling somebody great, okay? So what we want to think about in the case of greatness, what are these characteristics specifically? So the topic of our discussion today is, what are the specific characteristics that a nation needs for greatness to distinguish it among nations? And we might frame it even further questions like these. What do we value in our, what do we value in our nation? What should we value? What is worth working towards as citizens of our nation? What in a nation is worth sacrificing for? what do we need to preserve in our nation and as a nation? So tying it up, we want to know what you think. We want to have a discussion about that. What specific characteristics, what good or valued characteristics, if we have them to an elevated degree, make America great?
Hello, everybody. I'm David Anders. I'm chair of the Department of Political Science, and it's very nice to be here, and thank you for being here. I'm tasked with the job of explaining what the historical underpinnings are, the motivations are behind our United States Constitution, and I believe Dr. Mosley will then talk about the United States Constitution. I think it's interesting that my colleague was talking about, the kind of ambiguous nature of great. I think everyone here believes America is great. Great can mean powerful. It certainly can mean good. It means a lot of things. But my job right now is to talk about, the values historically that we believe are the foundation for what makes America great, and then are kind of lived and realized in large part through the United States Constitution. So, what are we doing here? We're really trying to, or what am I doing right now, is trying to talk about the foundation that enables America to be great, right? And, words don't mean much unless they're realized. So the words of ideas, of thoughts, of political theory, of the Constitution don't mean much unless they're realized. But things aren't really realized unless somehow or another they're put down in writing and they're found somewhere, that people think can provide guidance. And I think that if we look at what motivated the framers of the Constitution, that time in history is a monumental time period of political theory and political thought that stems back to the 18th century, the Enlightenment period, where it's a heady moment in history where humans challenge conventional wisdom and thinking about the human dynamic and what's possible and what should be, reasoning, logic, etc. One of the primary kind of outcomes of that is this idea that individuals matter. And I think one of the things that we probably can agree about is that it isn't so much about the Constitution and the government being great. It's about America and in everything that, the Constitution and the ideas that come from it, from the Enlightenment period, what they enable us to be able to do and express every day in this country. So what makes America great certainly has a lot to do with Americans, right? And how they use their freedom in many ways. So if we kind of think about the framers themselves and how they took these areas of political theory and philosophy and they processed them, and then what we know has happened is, American values are our kind of interpretation of so many political theories and thoughts from the Enlightenment period and elsewhere. The framers themselves were very educated people of a certain degree of wealth and had positions of power within the public, to be sure. The late Gore Vidal once told a story about, he was very close with the Kennedys, how John F. Kennedy asked him, how could this country, back in the time of its origination, how could this country produce such amazing political thinkers, right? And have produced such amazing political thought when we were just so small and so, in many ways, backward and remote. And of course, Vidal's comment was, well, long winters, no TV, no radio, just a lot of books to read. And just that moment of history where they're taking what their predecessors from the Enlightenment period had essentially espoused upon, and they tried to put it into practice. So, the Enlightenment period itself, many names that you might be familiar with. Hobbes, who believed that human beings were essentially evil and selfish and needed a government to essentially give them guidance and control. Locke and Rousseau, who believed in natural rights and the idea of the social contract between the people and their government. Montesquieu with separation of powers, that as much as government is there to in fact protect the rights we don't give up, that the government needs to somehow or another be held accountable through checks and balances. There are many Enlightenment thinkers and others, not from that period, that created and planted the seed of ideas that the framers of the Constitution latched onto, and this is true in the French Revolution as well, not only in the American Revolution, and put into practice in the United States. So I think that this idea that our values are what define us, our values in the Constitution have become American values, and they hail from an earlier period of political thought and discourse that we have benefited from, to be sure. So I'm not here at this moment to talk about how effective America has been in terms of realizing those goals, although that's what we hope to get from this discourse. But the reality is that what makes America great is this idea that in a moment of human history that the framers of the Constitution grabbed upon and put into practice, this idea that freedom matters in its various manifestations, that this idea that government matters but also needs to be held accountable and so forth. And there's all of these unbelievable thoughts and theories and beliefs that the framers had to wrestle with in a practical sense, and then also to pursue in a more pure kind of philosophical sense to craft a country. Much has been said about the motivation of the framers of the Constitution. Were they economically interested, from the historian Charles Beard and so forth? Were they selfish in their motivations? A lot of historians since that time have said, well, that's a little too simplistic. It's not that people's self-interest never comes into effect. But in reality, the United States is a very, very special place because of the fact that its Constitution, right, that embodies the values of the United States, not just the government, but its people and what we stand for. We are beneficiaries of generations of political thought about equality, freedom, individualism, and the country is great for the idea that those seeds were planted in the structure of our government. Regardless of the motivation, regardless of what you think the motivation of the framers was or what it was not, the reality is that we as Americans have taken those values that the framers gained from the Enlightenment period, did their best under multiple many variables in terms of their mindset of why they structured the government the way they did, and whatever the historical reality was of their motivations, we have now embraced those doctrines of freedom and opportunity and so forth as being purely American. And I think that that is the underlying foundation. That's the starting point for this discussion, which is, I think most people agree that what makes America great in so many ways is the idea of opportunity, and it unleashes the intellectual capacity of the population. And that has been an ongoing process. It isn't just something that happened in 1787 with the passage of the Constitution and so forth. It's something that we try to achieve and work toward, as flawed as we are. But those early philosophical theories and essentially political doctrines are key to why the United States has essentially become the preeminent country representing in practice the Enlightenment period. That expanded upon conventional thinking. Okay. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I want to thank the Institute and particularly the effective role that Kevin Anthony has been playing all along in terms of organizing today's event, and his genuine concern for democratic ideals in society. When he initially mentioned today's topic about American greatness, I found that to be quite fascinating. So thank you for your innovative ideas. I want to thank my colleague, Professor David Andrus, for his discussion of the historical foundation of the nation and some of the great contributions that the great European philosophers have made to our democracy. Indeed, the founding fathers of America borrowed many great ideas from the 17th and 18th century European philosophers, including John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. But it was the founding fathers of America who actually furnished much of the energy and practical political imagination when they drafted the U.S. Constitution. Imagine, they were able to institute some of the basic elements of the United States government. By that I mean the Department of War, the Department of State, the Department of Commerce, and many of the democratic institutions that we now have in place were the creation of the founding fathers back in 1787. But my task today is to identify the more fundamental principles and elements of our democratic society that has made America great. I am of the opinion, and I would say that the majority of our audience this afternoon would agree with me, that America has always been perceived by many people, not only here in America, but abroad in other countries. America has always been perceived of being a great society, a unique society, and an exceptional society. Oftentimes when I talk to new immigrants who come from various parts of the world, they tell me that the reason they opted to immigrate to America was because of America's unique place in the world. Many immigrants also have the opportunity to immigrate to other great societies such as Australia, South Africa, Canada, and various countries in Europe. But they often prefer the United States precisely because they come to view of America as a great and exceptional society. So what are some of the more specific characteristics of this great society? Certainly, Professor Andrus made references to some of the great ideals of American democracy, those ideals that were founded on classical liberalism. Without going into details about classical liberalism, but certainly the ideas of equality, that the intrinsic worth of each person should be seen as equal. Certainly freedom, individual rights and freedoms. Certainly the concept of private property, the concept of popular control, also known as popular sovereignty. All of these are very attractive elements of American ideals, and I would even take it to the next level and argue that these form the foundation of American political culture. But more specifically, the U.S. Constitution is a blueprint for a successful democratic society. I've had the opportunity to compare and contrast the American Constitution to that of some of the most progressive constitutions ever written, including the French Constitution. And by far, the American Constitution reflects a vision for the future. The Bill of Rights, for example, we all know that the Bill of Rights was an important contribution to our democracy, which has made America not only great, but also unique in many respects. Individual rights of citizens, individual liberties, freedom of religion, and protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. Other characteristics, more specific characteristics of this great society revolve around entrepreneurship, economic opportunities. Obviously, in the early days of American Republic, the abundance of rich land made the American economy very prosperous at the outset. But again, it takes a vision, it takes entrepreneurship and innovation to put it all together and bring about prosperity. So indeed, we have enjoyed economic prosperity, not only because of our geography, but also because of individualism, individual ideas, and certainly individual innovations. I would also argue that the U.S. Constitution offers other important features that have made American government and polity a much more attractive place than any other country that I can think of. Certainly, the concept of separation of powers, which has distinguished American democracy from any other democracy, is another important principle that has strengthened American institutions. I would also argue that division of power, also known as dispersion of power, is another important feature of our government and political system, which we all know about. The division of power as far as federalism is concerned makes America a unique society. The fact that each state has distinct constitutional powers to manage its own affair makes America a distinct and unique society. But may I also add the following by saying that the Founding Fathers had a vision for America. Okay, they were visionary. And as time has progressed, I have noticed that many political figures in this country simply lack this important quality which the Founding Fathers of America possessed back then. I was watching the Chinese Communist Party's Congress in the past couple of days, and I was quite fascinated by the Chinese leadership and their vision for China for the next 10 to 15 years. And I'm really wondering how many of our wonderful key politicians in Washington or Sacramento are projecting a vision for this nation. Obviously, everyone in this classroom is very concerned about America and its place in the world. We certainly want America to preserve its prominent position in world politics and the position that it occupies in the hearts and minds of every citizen around this planet. But the question is that, are we really focusing on that topic? Are we really maintaining our global position and status in the world? Where is the leadership in America? Do we have an effective leadership? Certainly, many political scientists and social scientists are concerned about American status and position in the world. Some would even argue that the United States is beginning to take a declining course in certain areas. So we need to be mindful of all of those facts. I will now defer to my other colleague, Lisa, with her remarks.
I'm remiss. This is Dr. Majid Mosley. He's with the political science. I didn't introduce him. I should have.
Okay.
Is that right? Lisa? Lisa Hooper?
So if we could,
Should we done?
I think you're okay. I think you're okay. So I'm tasked with sort of weaving this all together and launching this larger discussion. So I want to start off by thanking my colleagues. I thought that Chris did an almost perfect discussion of the concept of great, except he was equivocal on the World Series, and I just want to be very clear that the Dodgers are great, okay? All right, so our efforts here are to sort of establish a foundation for this discussion about what makes America great. And certainly, as our government is concerned, we have sort of an exceptional government in that there was so much thought and effort and consultation that was put forth in crafting our form of government, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. So as we start to think about our image, when we think of image, we think of what do we want to portray as a nation to the world? What are our values? What are these things that we believe represent the best parts of us? An image is sort of that external representation of us or a thing, right? And I joke with my counterparts on this panel because at one point during our conversation, they turned to me and they said, well, Lisa, you're on social networks. You can reach them via that platform, right? And it morphed into this conversation that I had with both members of this panel and other people in my life to talk about, you know, what social media has done in terms of sort of the promoting of image, right? And I think that that's a larger conversation that sort of extends beyond this. But if America had an Instagram page, what would it look like, right? So, and it's not going to advance for me. Okay. So freedom. Would that be something that you think that we promote? This idea that this is a free society, that we have the opportunity to express ourselves, that we're free from oppression, religious persecution. This is a fundamental tenet of the American society, okay? Equality. There are probably a number of countries where I wouldn't be welcome on a panel like this, yeah? Yeah. And that statement that all men are created equal, all people are created equal, was woven into many state constitutions at that time. Our colleagues talked about this concept of individualism, that each person was valuable unto him or herself. And that's something that, for most of us, we would argue is an attractive quality to the American society. Diversity. We're a nation of immigrants. We were founded by immigrants. The Statue of Liberty basically says, we welcome all of you. Color, creed, come, right? So we're a nation of immigrants. And we, as best we can within our institutions, attempt to have representation from all of America's voices. We're strong. And we really appreciate that concept. That is a fundamentally American concept, that we're strong, that we're stronger together, right? But we also have some pretty mighty past examples of our power. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the different ways that maybe we've exercised our strength over our history, but this is a fundamental part of how we promote our image in the world. We are strong. We are powerful. We are innovative. We believe that in the right environment, people will be able to realize their creativity, to put their talents to work, find work that suits their passion, suits their talents. I mean, think about all of the examples of Americans' contribution to the world. Electricity, our ability to drive cars and to fly in the sky. And frankly, we are quite okay with people making mistakes and getting up and starting over. We love the underdog. That is a quintessentially American concept. People overcoming extraordinary obstacles. That is who we are. That's how we came to be. Think about what it must have taken to travel from Europe to start this country. That passage wasn't easy. Coming here wasn't easy. Finding a place to live, starting your government, moving west, none of that could have possibly been easy, but it also took incredible creativity and ingenuity. And finally, I think the reason why immigrants come to this country over some of the other countries that you mentioned is the opportunity, right? We try to, as best we can, put our resources into our people so that they have the opportunity to be entrepreneurial, so that those who've served in the armed forces can come back and go to school on the GI Bill. We try as best we can to create an environment where people can realize their talents, pursue things that they find passion in. And I think that those are the things that if America had an Instagram page we would want to promote. The question is, are we doing all of those things? Is this an image or is this real? And that's what we want to try to discuss today.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, very good. I've got some charts here to take a look at. What's that, David? Oh, yeah, let's get this off here. Let's see what our survey comes up with.
Oh, we're in the way again.
One of the nice things I've found working at COC is we get such fabulous students. We really do. Well, we've got something that's really in the lead there by a lot. Diversity. Diversity. And I'm proud of that. Yeah, that our students would put that at top. Would anybody that had said diversity on your paper, would you like to raise your hand and talk about that? Like to say something about that? Put you on the front page. What is diversity? You know, maybe we should start with that.
I see her.
There.
Oh,
Go ahead.
What is diversity?
Yeah.
I mean, do you want a dictatorial definition?
Your definition.
My definition. Diversity itself, or the goodness of diversity? I'll go goodness of diversity. I see diversity as a positive thing, mainly the respect of diversity. Certainly there are, you can list a lot of positive attributes that would come from having a diverse society, but my focus is more on respecting that diversity and allowing that diversity to grow and not causing harm to other diverse opinions, even if you don't think that they maximize good, just that respect of other ideas just seems like a good precedent to set.
Great. Lisa?
So when you talk about the respect of others, there are various perspectives.
Yes.
Is that what you're?
Yeah.
So diverse perspectives.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I love working with this group is because what you gain when you're in an environment where you're interacting with people that have multiple perspectives on a topic is an appreciation for your understanding of your own interpretation of things. When you start to examine things from other people's perspectives, it enriches your understanding of your own perspective. And I think that's one of the things that diversity offers, is a different sort of a lens through which to see the world.
So the thought is, how diverse are we? To what extent is diversity a part of our fabric?
I don't have stats. Does anybody else?
Yeah, as an opinion, not as a.
Look at the room.
Yeah.
Can I pose a question? Did a civil rights movement? I haven't studied, but Europe didn't really go through as monumental a change as we did. Is that correct? So far, did they have a big civil rights movement in various European countries that had just an opinion I've heard thrown out there? And so did that set a positive precedent for the value of diversity because we have that big push? Is that a correct statement, or am I confused?
I'd like to answer that. Having lived in Italy, having been a student in Italy for a year, I spent my third year of college there and having gone back a number of times. There's not a lot of diversity in Italy. It's very stratified. It's very much, if the further down the boot you live, the more prejudice is held against you. It's gotten better, but they don't have the same diversity. You are not going to have the where you're from, your accent. it's going to be held against you. It's not as diverse as our society by any means.
I just want to say that diversity is an outcome of individualism, right? That unless you have a society through its constitution, its values, that recognizes the value of every individual, even though no one's promising pure equality. They're promising equal treatment by the government. But diversity is an outcome of that, and we haven't realized, obviously, equality. It's a work in progress.
Absolutely.
Right? But kind of part of my initial commentary and when I started is that you can't even get there if you don't have a society that values every individual. And so as much as we haven't realized that, and we need to have strong self-reflection about how much we actually welcome diversity. And historically and now and in contemporary times, what makes America impressive is that on paper and in practice, we value individual contributions. But on top of that are prejudices, elites, racism, things that get in the way of full realization of all the benefits of diverse, understanding. And so, we're privileged to be pursuing diversity and diverse, and an understanding of all the diverse components of a multicultural society, of a very dynamic society. But that is great. But the question then becomes, how well are we doing? Right? And how much does everybody actually appreciate diversity? Right? That's the secondary question.
Another question would be, which direction are we? Are we in the direction of getting more? Are we moving more towards more accepting of various perspectives, or are we moving the other direction? And I would throw out the observation that certain things are happening today in America that make you wonder a little bit about that, and make you wonder if we are at least backpedaling slightly, to not overstate it. But at least I'm wondering in certain regions, perhaps. Yeah.
Also on the issue of diversity, I would have to say that the United States, if we set aside diversity in terms of ideas and just focus on ethnicity in terms of race, racial diversity, and place of origin, I would have to say that the United States has become much more diverse over the past 60 years or so. The United States maintains very liberal immigration policy in comparison to the immigration policies that are now being implemented by governments such as Australia or Germany or France. Look, in France, if you do not speak French or do not show full command of French, you will never be assimilated into French political system or culture. So therefore, as much as a lot of immigrants may complain that we have not been lenient in terms of our immigration policy, I would have to say that I respectfully disagree with that. The United States has always been very open and receptive toward immigrants from different parts of the world. And certainly we are much more liberal in terms of our immigration policy. And then I would say that Canada is ranked somewhere at the top.
And if I may, Professor Blakey was talking about, he feels as though that there's something in society right now where, are we having a reckoning?
And I was talking about just general attitudes.
General attitudes,
not
right.
immigration.
Right. But I think, look, if we take the president's campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," okay, it infers that either America's not great now or it's not as great as it used to be, right? And so whether you think that's true or not, that's to a person to decide. But that reflects the idea of that slogan combined with other statements is why many people believe there's what we call a reactionary movement going on, whether that's Trumpism, whether that's Tea Party, the Freedom Caucus, that there are people that want to roll back the clock, right? And I can point to particular things that have been done and said, right? Not just from President Trump, but from many people in society
that suggests that obviously there is a core element of American society that is not looking at diversity in the way, and not only diversity in terms of reactionary, but not looking at the trajectory of America as being appropriate or proper from their mindset. So that is why, I mean, obviously this feeling that people are wondering, right, or taking into account, you know, do we like diversity? Do we like diverse opinions? Do we like the trajectory of America? You know, that's why we say there's a civil war in the Republican Party. They're at odds with, just within their own party, of what direction they want to take America. And that goes back to Dr. Mosley's point about, obviously, in a more authoritarian mindset and society like China, you can have a more streamlined vision, you know, in terms of where you want to take the country. And in a democracy where freedom of speech and ideas are all competing, it's really hard for everyone to agree. And that's why people think democracy, maybe some people think it's easy. It's the most difficult form of government, right? Because you have to hear it all and consider it all.
Yeah, I want to go back to your point on the historical context of, you know, equality. We were talking about freedom. You know, most of our founding fathers, you guys mentioned, most of them a lot of them were slave owners. A lot of them were, you know, related to slave owners. And yeah, you made a point that, you know, throughout our history, you know, we've been really accepting. You know, we've really preached equality.
I don't know if I said that.
Well, it was mentioned. It was something about the historical context,
right?
And then you guys say they have this vision for this country, and I don't believe the founding fathers had that vision. If they owned slaves or they had family members that owned slaves, I don't think mainstream Americans back in the founding fathers looked at these people as even close on the same level, same circle.
I would agree with you, and that's why when I made my comments, I tried to make them almost in a vacuum of the words themselves, and that's why we're hoping that this conversation would come out. Have we realized that the framers of the Constitution did not necessarily have an all-encompassing vision for all Americans and all of its diversity, but what we are beneficiaries of now, well over 200 years later, are the principles and the words that we can keep striving for. But there's no question about it that the framers of the Constitution either didn't have a holistic vision of equality and individual rights, or they were deferring it. And some of them knew that it was only a matter of time, right, before, and some of them were abolitionists and did believe that it had to happen. They themselves were a diverse group of thinkers, right? And so the fact is that we try to start off with what are the principles that we can benefit from and what make America great. And then the second part is, are we as great as we think we are if we haven't lived up to those in real life? So point well taken.
Yeah, so I believe that they were visionary, but when the Constitution was put into effect, the only people who could vote on it were white male property owners, correct?
Reinforcing his statement.
Yeah, so I think they only made it for people like themselves, people in power, to continue being in power over time, like without thinking about the diverse other groups of people, because they were like representing maybe 10% of like the people who are actually living in current America. So I don't think they're really thinking about everyone else, but mainly like the rich white class.
So then the question becomes, if this was what we put forth, this is our value, are we better today than we were then in terms of our interpretation of all people are equal?
Yes, but when they wrote it, it was all men are created equal, and there was definitely
to a woman.
it has definitely come very far because we've taken that interpretation and we spread it out over time because we realize that people are equal to each other and we're all beings that don't deserve that.
But you represent the most tolerant and accepting generation that's ever walked the face of the earth. We still got work to do.
Definitely.
We still have work to do. Are we blazing the trail? Is America blazing the trail?
I believe we are much more progressive than many other countries in our society today. If you go anywhere else, like you said, you couldn't be standing up there. Women aren't represented. Other ethnicities aren't represented. And it may be much less in America, like not as much like equality per se, but it is much more than other countries, no doubt. So we are coming up like a little bit. Like over time, I believe that we will get there, but I believe that older ideals will keep on flowing through to their children about things like racism, and I don't think it could ever really end because people learn from their parents. And that is a very, like no doubt, like I grew up with people learning from their parents.
I have to keep. So if diverse perspectives are how we help to sort of fortify our position on things, what do you think that an environment like college offers?
Oh, it's definitely completely different because you go from your family getting one set of ideas to a whole array. Like it opens up a whole new chapter.
So would college ever change your mind toward things that perhaps had been shared or imparted through the modeling of your parents?
Yes, but not everyone goes to college. Not everyone
Agreed.
opens up.
Agreed.
Not everyone opens up their mind to that. And even if they do, they get caught in this little, an echo chamber. And they only want to hear their own thoughts. And they're not going to listen to any form of diverse opinion that you might have to say. Because it doesn't really matter. Because they've been ingrained with this thought. And they believe it to be true.
Look, can I chime in here?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, your points are, of course, well taken. And historically, certainly, we would want to say that we had some shortcomings. Okay, but I would also want to connect to Professor Andrus's comments that he was bringing up the kind of the bare bones concept ideal of these terms, these words, these concepts, and over time, so they were there. The ideas were there, and we've kind of grown into them, right? There's been a great deal of moral development in our culture, I would say, over the past 250 years, 300 years, even though we weren't a nation that whole time, but we did have a culture for quite a while before that. And so, we've done that. But let's take it back to what we want to talk about now. We don't necessarily want to, we want to have a conversation about what we think today about what makes America great, right? Because we know we've been some places that weren't great. And we continue to have some places in our culture that aren't great. What makes it great is what would make it great if you think it isn't, right? That's what we want to talk about.
And one of the things I want to say, which is, regardless of whether you're in college or not in college, what have you, one of the things that, and my sociological colleagues are in the audience, and this is a psychology issue also, and that is how easy is it for anybody of any generation to have a real-time reflection? How easy is it for any society to see themselves clearly? Hindsight's 2020, history 2020. And so whether it's now, whether it's 20 years ago when same-sex marriage did not have the majority favorable opinion in the country, and then 20 years later it's changed, right? 200 years ago, men, obviously slaves, women, and so forth, all these different, inequitable categories. And so, we are all confined by the systems that tell us how to live and how to think. And it is a tough job in real time, in a contemporary self-reflection analysis, to understand what are we doing now that is in fact wrong, that we won't see until 20 years from now. And I know right now there's an ongoing dialogue in America among men. Have I ever been a sexual harasser and I don't get it? Right? What have I done to any of my colleagues, friends, or anybody that I never thought was sexual harassment? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm ashamed, right, that I did that. And I thought it was harmless. It is very difficult to extricate yourself from the social kind of bounds of what we think is acceptable. And that's why it's that moral development. It's just ongoing. And that is not meant to excuse past bad behavior, but it is meant to make us understand that we can evolve.
Yeah, let me go on record. I'm not trying to undersell or understate any of those major problems we've had in the past. I'm not trying to deny that at all. Okay, so understand that.
I absolutely understand and relate your concerns, but from a political perspective, I would have to say that certainly the founding fathers with all the shortcomings that one might be able to identify about certain practices back then, back in 1787, the country has made tremendous progress over the past 240 years or so, ever since the Constitution was adopted. And that is precisely because of the Founding Fathers' vision and the foundation that they certainly established. And that is something that one cannot dispute, in my judgment. There's certainly issues of concern from a historical perspective, but nonetheless, this is an impressive achievement. And that is precisely why the President of the United States or our ambassador to the United Nations takes an issue before the international body. The rest of the world pays attention to the U.S. precisely because of whatever it is that makes America great, whether it's our innovation, our contribution to human civilization, or whether it's our military strength, whatever that might be, the reality is that America still projects tremendous amount of uniqueness, greatness, exceptionalism, however you want to label that.
And I do think that comes from individual Americans. And I'm not trying to talk down to the government, because the structure of our government is impressive in many ways. In other ways, we see the limitations of it and so forth. But if you look at American history, it is a whole set of individuals that challenged authority, that challenged conventional wisdom, that stood up for themselves, well beyond the military, right? Just in civil society, just people, standing up for their rights and shaping what America stands for in practice every day. That's an ongoing fight, and that's why we go back to the reason America has evolved is because going back to the original principle and statement of individualism is that individuals can in fact make a difference and shape what America stands for and how much it realizes its ideals.
And I would like to interject. Individualism, extremely important. However, as I went back and just read some of the Constitution just a couple of days ago, in the preface, it does say, and we will do these things for the common good. And I think that's something we should not forget.
And if I could just put a little context with this, I'm going to ask my professors that are in political science, is it a fair characterization to say that our Constitutional Convention was pretty chaotic?
On certain topics there was fierce debate among the delegates, certainly involving the allocation of power and resources. But I would say that on most topics that were of fundamental concern to the Founding Fathers, such as separation of powers, dispersion of power, and so forth, I think there was more consensus among the founders.
And we have to be careful not to celebrate the outcome of the Constitutional Convention as something, coming down from the heavens. It was a political fight through compromise, things like federalism and bicameralism and so forth. These are practical outcomes of a whole bunch of smart people that all had different beliefs about what the most important aspects of creating a new country and government was about. And so as much as we're talking about lofty ideals, in practice, America is also pragmatic and the result of compromise.
Having said that, James Madison told the Constitutional Convention on June 26, 1787, that we decide, these are his exact words, we decide forever the future of Republican government. By Republican or Republicanism, he meant to imply the future of democracy, the future of a representative form of government. So again, these folks were visionary in my judgment. I mean, we're talking about 200 some odd years ago, having these kinds of debates.
And let me launch in. You political scientists, correct me if I'm saying something incorrect, but from my understanding, at the beginning of our republic, things were pretty tenuous for quite a while. I mean, we were hanging by a thread for a while, and it took a lot of work and effort and courage to establish the democratic institutions that we established. and over a long period of time. And people have been doing this ever since.
And also,
And we need to continue
Sorry.
doing this because our democratic institutions will only be preserved if we preserve them and you preserve them.
and also remember that the framers of our Constitution had some other important concerns, one of which was preserving American territorial integrity and sovereignty back then. So again, it all
And that work in progress, the Constitution is a legal document, but it took generations before it had moral authority, right? At first, we didn't know that the country was going to survive at the beginning. Obviously, the British wanted their colonies back and so forth, and it was a very difficult situation. But through that longevity, the moral authority of the Constitution and hence the United States started to take hold.
Should we move it on to?
I did have a contribution a little while ago, and I'm gonna say it now. This concept has come up in various forms from all of my colleagues that these ideals, these things that we're trying to promote, this image that we have, it requires nurturing. It requires some attention, right? These things are not static. They require discourse. They require opportunities like this to listen to diverse perspectives. And that's really what we had hoped today would be about. I mean, freedom of speech is the third thing that this group identified as being something that makes America great. The space and the encouragement to speak your mind, to have an opinion, and to have a platform in which you can voice it. That's an essential part of the American culture. And so I think that we do need to open it up. We do need to hear from you guys. And it doesn't need to be us talking with you. It can be you talking with you. No question.
so it's time for you guys to pose questions.
Especially with all the social.
Are we
media.
moving forward? Are we moving towards these things?
I mean, if anybody else would speak out. A big problem I think I see, and I'm not an expert on social, but it seems like we have kind of a perverted interpretation of individualism, where it isn't truly about an individual pursuing what he wants, but an individual pursuing material and pursuing wealth.
Can I offer you my version of individualism?
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't know if my colleagues would venture to agree, but they're more than welcome to articulate their own interpretation. I would argue that individualism is defined in the following fashion: that American polity, the political environment, the constitutional foundation, American polity, this whole political environment exists to fulfill the rights of each individual to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. But obviously that's open to interpretation. Indeed, in this country, you have the right to live. But if you were a citizen of Germany, the reign of Nazism, you did not have the right to live. If you were a Tutsi living in Africa, you did not have the right to live. If you're a Muslim living in former Yugoslavia or in certain parts of China, you may not have the right to live. If you're a resident of the state of Chiapas in Mexico, you may not have the right to live. So that's life. Okay, liberty, that's also can be defined in terms of individual freedoms and so forth. And the pursuit of happiness. I mean, millions of Americans give up their own time to volunteer, okay? They travel to Afghanistan, Nigeria, and other parts of the world, Doctors Without Borders, to help fellow humans. That I think is a characteristic of American greatness. But again, as Professor Andrews said, it all goes back to individualism.
But do you think individualism no longer is a defining quality of what makes us great? That's because you think it's a perverse sense of individualism.
I think that there is a perverted sense of individualism, and I can't say this with any authority or knowledge, great knowledge, but there just seems to be a sort of idea that you have the right to pursue your own goals at the expense of people, your family, your friends, greater wisdom. It seems like an idea, like you should just go for it. You should just make a lot of money.
Well, there has been, if I may add just quickly, there has been this has been part of our economic philosophy, economic tradition. Because we practice capitalism, there has always been an emphasis on individual self-advancement.
Yeah.
And many conservative political thinkers in the United States, even as early as the days of Edmund Burke, who happens to be one of the foremost authorities on conservatism, there has always been an argument made in favor of individual self-advancement, that you're on your own. You must rely on your own resources rather than governmental resources. I think one has to make a distinction between individual self-advancement or individualism.
We have a question here.
Yeah. I was going to say in the discussion about if we're advancing or not, on a personal level, I would say yes until November 8th. I think that what we saw was a complete rejection of the past 8 years of what many have seen as pursuing of a progressive value, moving towards more open speech, of moving towards more welcoming of a more diverse culture due to our immigration system and everyone coming in. It's been a melting pot since the beginning. And, you know, I work in politics, I work with nonprofit groups. And what I see on a more personal level, just person to person, is people have retreated to their corners. And it's not so much an open discussion on differing values as it is yelling. You know, it's more yelling, it's, you know, oh, you're a liberal, you know, screw off, oh, you're a conservative, oh, screw off. And I think what you're seeing at the governmental level, and you're seeing the current office holders take and the positions they're taking, is not a desire to work together, pursuing policies which I think many would agree are far more regressive, and it's affecting us on a national level, where you see us and how we have been on the world stage not look so good anymore. And I know, I can't tell if the current administration, I don't know if they want to be isolationist, protectionist, or if they're looking towards a more expansive role. It varies on the day. But I just think that you're seeing a dramatic shift. And there was an interesting study I saw that when you look at accepting of diverse cultures, it tends to hug the coasts, where there are massive trading ports and where there's a big fluid mix of various cultures, and that gets far more regressive as you get towards mainland United States. Just an interesting thought there, but just something I've noticed over the past 10 months.
I'd like to respond to what you said. You know, I don't want to sugarcoat, you know, any of the things. I think as we move forward in society, we need to be honest, and we need to be, you know, sometimes completely unfiltered. You know, obviously without personally attacking people, but what happened on the last election cycle was mainstream Americans, mostly white Americans who felt that the past 40, 50, 60 years, they've seen a changing country. And you see it a lot in the Midwest. A lot of them used to be Obama voters, and they switched over to Trump. And a lot of them are seeing their culture change. A lot of them are seeing their town change and their community change. And hey, a lot of these people don't like it. And if you look at our country as a whole, we do have a diverse society now, but it is very segregated. If you want to go into many parts of LA, it's going to be exclusively pretty much one race. So I think it's divided by ethnicity and also socioeconomics. So a lot of more middle, upper income communities are going to be primarily white and Asian. And, you know, I just think it's really important. If this country wants to move forward with the changing demographics, we still have to respect the individual rights and the individual cultures of every group in the country, not just certain groups. And it's important to have that dialogue and understand where they're coming from and where their fears are. Because people keep saying, oh, why are all these Trump supporters? Oh, they're all so racist. They're this and they're that. And if we're going to be completely honest, it's mostly low-income Americans, a lot of them in the Midwest, and throughout a lot of the country, who want to maintain their culture and they want to maintain their people, and they feel, whether it's rational or unrational, that that's being under threat by the increasing diversity of the country.
Well, I would say that there are many conservatives in the United States who are of the opinion that this diversity is somewhat threatening to the traditional values of American political culture. And certainly there's an argument to be made that some conservatives also believe that many of these diversities that we're beginning to observe in America and the diverse groups of people, including many immigrants, have failed to absorb or embrace American traditional values. So that is a legitimate concern on their part if you talk to them. And certainly economic conditions, today's economic conditions in various parts of the country have reinforced that notion. So there is a correlation between the economic conditions as well as our perception of diversity.
Good question right there.
Yeah. I think in response to what some of the other students have said, for me personally, it didn't start after the last election cycle. I think to say that would imply that Trump is the disease rather than a symptom of a system that has had these issues already present in it. I think that started long before he came into power and will probably persist long after.
I'd like to respond to that. That there's a lot of analysis, going on right now that the president is a symptom, right? And that in reality, the movement that he represents, however you want to define that, is bigger than him and will take shape and form well beyond his time in office. And whether you agree with that or not, it goes back to this gentleman's statement about how we're the character of the country and how that is represented by a huge segment of that group. And one of the analyses out there is that it isn't about getting anything done. It's just they just want to roar, right? They just want to roar, even if it's not kind of any continuum of thought or it has any cogent nature to like policy or whatever. It's just that they just want to roar, and overwhelmingly the majority, although it's 1/6 of the electorate, the majority of Trump supporters are not put off by his style, right? And so that reinforces that notion that it's not just him. I'm sorry, Mrs. Williams. Yeah.
I think these are really important contributions, and I just have to tease a little more from them. Because I don't think that anybody would disagree that this didn't all happen as a result of this election. There had to have been something going on in our political climate, our culture, that allowed someone, and my issue with Trump is I don't know often what his positions are. I don't have a good understanding of where he is taking us. It's really very unclear to me, and it seems to change depending upon what I hear from him. But what in our system allowed for someone who wasn't making often substantive arguments on policy or the direction that he would take us, what allowed him to be elected, do you think? What are the disease, the roots of the disease?
I guess for me, it comes from a standpoint of more of the culture, and that includes the culture of just our nation in general, I think, where we would, allow for xenophobia and just all the racially charged remarks and things like that, where they would let it slide, or with the sexual harassment, because of all those things that many people are against, it was still somehow able to get by. And to me, obviously, that's unacceptable, but it's just crazy to think that despite all that, someone could have gotten power.
I think that, from my, observance of the past, few years in the last election was that people are tired of all the infighting between our elected officials. They are tired of not just infighting, but outfighting. They want to see our elected officials find a way to work together. If we go out and we do a job and all we're doing is fighting with each other, we get fired. And yet, so, and they're still suffering, like people have brought up, in the Midwest and whatever, and they don't feel like they're being listened to. And I honestly believe that someone like that was able to be elected because they don't understand what politics is. All they know is do I have money to put on, do I have food to put on the table? Can I pay my bills? Can I put my kids through school? So they don't understand. And so they're equating what they're seeing on the media as fighting and not getting the job done. And so that's politics to them. So let's change that. Let's elect somebody who isn't in the political system. Even if he is as heinous as our president now and the things that he has been accused of doing, hey, that's better because at least maybe he'll get a job done. Because our people that we've got in there now are not because all they do is fight with each other, and we can't have that anymore. I think that's what happened.
And I want to say that I like to look at things through systems of power, economic systems, religious systems, political systems, and so forth. And the fact is that in the history, especially since post-World War II, there's this idea of, the American dream, right? And if we look back over the last 40 plus years, the disparity of wealth is grown. So now all of a sudden the growing inequality threatens your ability as an individual to realize your full potential. And I think the frustration and the anger, although it's directed, and it is directed purposefully at government by many operatives, that government is your problem and so forth. And that's not to say government isn't always a problem. It's that the capitalist system that defines individualism as for you versus individual contributions in a democracy is about the public interest in the public good. And I think that this, whether you want to call them myths or whether you want to call them dreams that are very difficult to realize now versus, say, 40 years ago, it's this idea that people are really frustrated because it is, to have everything that you think you are promised by the American social contract is not happening, right? And then you turn on, going back to symbols and what Lisa's presentation was about with media and so forth, when you look at how we worship wealthy athletes, wealthy celebrities, Access Hollywood, and people sit back and say, I want that to be me, right? And then you get into the lack of spirituality in that and materialism. There are so many other variables at play in America other than the government that come from all different areas of society that help understand and explain, right, the phenomenon of frustration. And I think one of the problems is, and we can blame government for a lot of it, but it is embedded in the culture in many other areas.
Yeah, if I may add, you brought up a very important point with regards to political polarization in this country. Yes, our country has become much more polarized along ideological and whatever lines you want to think of. But the reality is, as Professor Anders correctly said, certainly economic conditions have made people more politically anxious, more politically inclined. When you become economically destitute, as it is the case in certain parts of the country, you begin to search for political answers. Yeah. And this is not unprecedented, by the way. It's happened in many parts of the world, in some of the most advanced industrialized countries, where economic conditions produce a new political landscape in the country.
Yes, I just believe that if we need to sit down and really start listening to each other and respecting each other on all levels and finding a way to some real solutions. Because when we're saying it's our way, it's this way, and we're not finding the commonality, then nothing gets done. And the people, the regular people out there, the regular folks that do not understand how things work are tired of that. And I am seeing that this is why people on the fringe, like someone like Bernie or someone like Donald Trump, would even be considered. because they are more on the fringe. And I'm not saying that, there wasn't good ideas coming out of the fringe, but I think somewhere in the middle has to be the truth. And that's how we're designed. That's why we have like a separation of powers. That's why to me, as I think it's so that one side or the other doesn't take over, right? And I just think we need to sit down and start listening. I like what we're doing here. I think it's a really good idea. And I think there has to be responsibility within the media because people are busy. They don't really, like I said, understand, and they are listening to the media and they are saying, okay, this has to be true, and they're not questioning. So, these are, it's just my.
So in response to her, could we agree that part of the problem would be that America has become too large, that all our subcultures have come together in a sort of classing relationship, like left wing, right wing, immigrants on the coast and no immigrants in the Midwest. So could we say that everyone is feeling underrepresented? So when someone like Trump gets elected, a lot of people in one area are saying, no, we hate this. And on the other side, they're saying, no, we like this. So could we say that as a result of America becoming too large, we're becoming underrepresented?
I think it's fascinating. I think that there are people who would very much agree with you. I don't think that we're too large, but I do think that there's an argument to be made that maybe we're not doing the best job of representing our population.
I do think columnist David Brooks from the New York Times, quite a few years ago, I say 4 or 5, started raising the question in his columns, is America governable still, right? And because of the subcultures and all the kind of fragmentation. And going back to this woman's comment about the idea of the system, right? If you just look at the congressional composition, 535 total members, the system is built on compromise, right? And so what you have is a lot of ideologues in there that say, you are a failure if you back down from your principles. And being principled is a very American, kind of celebrated value. But the system is about governance. And the problem with the politicians today is they're ideologues, and it's okay to have an ideology, but they're less inclined to govern, right? Which makes you more moderated in your behavior. Sorry, I know Chris has something to say.
Yeah, I do agree. Did you want to say something?
No, I'm trying to get a question.
Right. Very quickly, let me reflect on what has been said so far. I do agree that the country has become extremely difficult to govern because of so many reasons, subcultures, representation, all that. But the reality is that, unfortunately, as Professor Andrews correctly said, there are certain folks in the government who are not good students of politics, meaning that they don't know how to compromise. Yes, you need to defend and promote your principles, but at the end of the day, the founding fathers of America, were able to strike all kinds of compromises on very important issues that impacted the country back in 1787. Another concern that I have, that I want to share with you, is that I think that a segment of American leadership, or people who are in position of power, are compromising American national interests. To me, what is important is protecting American national interests. And I'm not convinced that some people in position of power, including representatives from corporate America, are really looking after America's national interests. That's why I think a lot of folks in America are beginning to lose faith in leadership in Washington. Our jobs being outsourced to other countries. And the arguments being made that, well, we have to remain competitive. Our corporate interests, as much as I'm a capitalist, believe me, I'm a staunch supporter of capitalism. Kind and gentle capitalism. Compassionate. Thank you. It just doesn't make any sense for Apple Corporation to create 10,000 jobs only in China, where our people in this country are suffering from unemployment. And who did they turn to?
We had a
Yeah, maybe first and then over here.
So one thing that I just want to reflect that you had touched on is just the core voters and who really decides the election. And you see that, like I've worked in campaign finance. And what you see is a very interesting payment system of who funds campaigns, who pays for the ads. And when you pull the curtain back, and you really see who's donating to these candidates and making them viable because you need money to win elections. So, in the most part, it prices most good people out. Corporations will pick their candidate, they'll run their candidate, and most of the time they'll win. Most of the time people are able to buy elections, per se. I can say just in this district, Canada I work for, we had almost $10 million levied against us. So that's just in this district alone. There was a special election earlier in the year where $50 million was spent by one side for a congressional seat. And, you know, when I made my reference to November 8th, this has been a growing issue. I just think when you have KKK rallies and white supremacist rallies after an election, I think people have been given the green light to start saying, okay, we're going to go public now with our beliefs. One of the other issues that was seen was economic changes. You know, the United States has always been a very staunch manufacturing company, and as the world economy changes to a more service economy, a service sector economy, and AI, automatic technology taking over, Trump's backbone came from what used to be the Blue Belt, what used to be the manufacturing area of the country, coal country, steel country. After those have left and they've been either outsourced or, you know, I think we can all agree coal isn't a viable energy source anymore, is a lot of people don't believe that because that was the backbone of their town, that was the backbone of their state. So you saw a lot of economic voters. And again, there were the people who thought, gee, the white majority is dwindling. You know, we don't have 99% of the power, we only have 96 now. Oh God, it's going away real quick. Time to take this to more regressive policies. And
so when you say what you're saying, you know, one of the premises, and my political science counterparts can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the foundational principles of democracy is to take power from people with wealth and to give it to everyone, right? So when you say to us, given your experience, that you're seeing millions of dollars being spent in elections that are impacting this community right here, would we then be able to extrapolate from that maybe we need to pull some of the ways that we finance campaigns and reform them, right? That we should have every right to know where the money is coming from in a campaign, who's buying those ads, and that they can't brand themselves the way they want to brand themselves, right? Would that, if we pulled some of the veil off of the financing, do you think that voters would make better decisions? Or is it still driven by money?
I think to an extent it will still be driven by money. So when they brought in Citizens United, I think that started the unraveling of political finance and campaign finance. And what you're seeing on an overall system is even in the Justice Department, even in the judicial branch of government, the Supreme Court, which is supposed to be one of the most unbiased systems in the country, is completely biased. You could see every vote going back a while now where it is split evenly among party lines. And as long as that continues, I think any law passed by whoever has the control of the Supreme Court will hold that. So I don't think you will see an overturning of laws like that for quite some time.
So the incentive is to take your country to China, make a whole bunch of money so that you can take that money back and influence elections. Is that your perception?
Think about that. But
you know, what you're getting at in relation to campaign finance is really about, as legally speaking, constitutionally, is free speech. And it goes back to the underpinning values of this country, which is freedom, right? And how we define free speech. The Supreme Court says money is political speech and should be protected. It's a fundamental First Amendment right. They say it is, so I have to accept it. But I can disagree with them, right? I don't think it's speech, okay? But even if it is, because we have a capitalist system where inequities are built into that system on purpose. And in fact, if you have full employment, it's bad for the economy, you know, in many market analyses and so forth. So the reality is that even if we accept that money is speech, why don't we regulate it like we do other types of speech for the collective good? And I think that this issue about campaign finance and money being a protected right, when we know there's a disparity of wealth upward, is what many people say is evidence that the elites don't really care, and there's not a uniform idea of what it means to have democracy realized.
But also bear in mind that there are other actors in American politics that they need to assume greater responsibilities, such as the media, mass communication. I mean, they know very well the desires of the masses. For example, potential electorate in America exceeds 180 million people. They need to hear from other candidates, particularly third-party candidates. Why is it that the media, mass communication, who, by the way, represents a more liberal ideology in this country, has failed to extend an invitation to third-party candidates? This has nothing to do with the Supreme Court.
It's a dominance of the two-party system that has taken over, you know, and there's been some fringe of, you know, the Green Party, maybe peace and freedom to a certain extent, libertarian parties, but they haven't been able to get as much traction, and it's because they don't get the exposure.
Well, that's true, but because of the nature of the media is a private enterprise which is out there to maximize its profit. Therefore, they're not interested. They're interested in news sensationalism. That way they can maximize their profit. They're not interested in promoting civic engagement and educating the American public to get enough exposure to other ideas, including diverse political ideas espoused by third-party candidates.
We have a question he's been hanging on for a half hour.
Sorry.
I can see that diversity is the greatest power or strength that makes this country great. But do you think the two-power system that we have today support or suppress the immense power of diversity?
Say it one more time, please.
I can see that diversity has the greatest strength that makes this country great.
Is diversity the greatest strength?
But the two-party system that we have today really support or suppress the immense power of diversity.
Are you asking whether the two-party domination suppresses diversity in this country?
Yes.
Yes. I think it suppresses economic diversity, to be sure.
Because
they're both recipients of massive amounts of organized corporate money. There's union money in there as well, but overwhelmingly the money. Yeah, they are both kind of appendages of the business class, the Democrats and Republicans. Many people think that the Democrats and Republicans are so different, and on a particular peripheral policy issues they are. They both represent the business class.
Also remember that both parties are cognizant of the fact that in order to win an election, be it local, state, or national, that they would need to appeal to a broad group of supporters. And I'm not so sure if that holds true. I mean, whether whether political parties are engaging in active suppression of diversity in this country. I'm not convinced.
Well, I wonder if his question didn't intend to ask us to consider if given the diverse perspectives that our melting pot represents, if perhaps we don't feel represented by one of the two parties, are we not participating? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because what I see is having a bipartisan or two-party system. It feels like even if we have diversity, at the end of the day, when it comes to decision or representing opinion, you have to choose whether you have to be Republican or Democrat. Now, where's democracy? I mean, where's the other opinion that has to be represented and that deserves equal attention, or maybe that could change the world? Well, I mean, this can be really bring to another time to mention.
Yeah, but the counter argument to yours would be that the two-party system has contributed to America's stability and continuity, whereas most democracies, such as Canada, Spain, France, Germany, they operate with some sort of a multi-party system, where passing legislation and reaching some sort of a consensus has become a challenge, and their governments tend to be somewhat fragile. But again, I think both systems have disadvantages and advantages that we need to be mindful of. But again, I'm not convinced if the two-party domination, if you were to use that term, has engaged in active suppression of ideas.
I want to note something, couple things. One, I want to say something about capitalism. And then I want to go back to individualism for a second, okay? So one thing I think that's coming, to the forefront here is we've got a lot of complicated issues and problems, and a lot of intermingled kinds of things. One of those major thrusts of intermingled problems, I think, comes from our capitalistic values, because capitalism is not very helpful when it comes to truth, when it comes to equality, when it comes to hearing everybody's opinion, because the values that we gather, that wealth is so important, and then what wealth can do, undermine some of those voices, okay? So, and because the news outlets that we have are concerned with the bottom line, they don't care so much about truth. They care about how many viewers they get. And if you want to watch a really good film on that, watch Good Night and Good Luck, and also a movie called Truth. They're both quite good about that, and especially Good Night and Good Luck, back in the 50s. And so I think capitalism has some major, it produces some huge tensions for our society. And, maybe we need to do something about that. I'm not sure exactly what. And then I want to go back to individualism. And Nathan was saying that the individualism we have today is somehow different, maybe. Now, this might be a little bit romanticized, but I think there's something right about this. Adam Smith, one of the original proponents or originators of capitalism, he was a moralist. He was a moral philosopher. And when he was writing about self-interest, everybody should do what's in their own self-interest. When he said that, he meant, as long as you are a decent human being and you treat people respectfully and you don't exploit people, and he understood that. I mean, that was understood with his readers, with his expected readers. And he was not expecting people, you've seen the movie Wall Street, greed is good. No, he wasn't saying that at all. And so, and this might sound moralistic, but so be it. It seems like we have some of those moral anchors, whatever they are, that's a big conversation, it seems like those have eroded somewhat from 200 years ago. I think it's a pretty safe statement. And I think that has affected our view of what individualism is negatively.
And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not a philosopher, but I believe that Smith also, people read Smith in isolation, certain pockets of that. They don't read the whole context. And he believed that the state, the government, would most likely be necessary to step in and help regulate to a certain extent capitalism based on what can happen, right, in terms of perverse individualism and so forth. So that's part of it.
But tying that back to Majid's point about media and political parties, I want to make one more comment very quickly, and that is, media is a private enterprise. So we're back to that idea of what is there. If you're a private corporation in media, you have a fiduciary duty to make profit, a legal duty to make profit for your shareholders. There's no legal duty to inform the public, properly in a privately owned media. Now, we don't want state-run media. We're not saying that. But what we are saying is just because media is not controlled and run by government does not mean that we are out of the woods in terms of it doing its job for a well-informed citizenry. Not at all, okay? And I'm going to point to CNN as kind of one of these problems of the party system. We can look at Fox or Rachel Maddow and MSNBC and we can say, okay, they have strong bents in one direction or another. But CNN reflects the two-party system. And Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, they're really not the periphery as much as people think because they represent millions of people. And when CNN has Democratic and Republican Party operatives on, they think they have the spectrum covered. They are excluding millions of people that the parties don't speak for. But they come across as if, that they are very representative of all of America by having both parties represented. And that is a great disservice back to the diversity of the American electorate.
Excellent point. As I said just a minute ago, why is it that the mass media of communication does not assume responsibility? The most central concept in politics is power. P-O-W-E-R. In 600 BC, the Greek philosopher Pittacus said, the measure of man is what he does with power. I would argue that there are certain institutions in the United States political system, the media, one of them, must assume greater responsibility. Yes, they're out there to make profit. Professor Anders is correct. But again, they also need to assume responsibility. The same rule also applies to policyholders. Position of power, they need to assume great responsibility. So again, in order to make sure that the office holders assume responsibility and fulfill the responsibilities of their offices, one has to become more involved, civically involved. So again, it's incumbent upon us to pay attention to what happens in the world of politics on a daily basis, rather than being distant from them.
Okay, we're going to conclude here in just a few minutes.
What's a question back there?
We will. I'm going to take a couple more questions from our audience here. But before I do that, I'm going to ask each one of our panel to give a concluding comment, possibly. Maybe you want to add what you think makes America great. And
I want to try to pull a couple of these comments together to the question from the back. And I do think that the media has a role to play in this, but I think that especially for this generation, the generation that's mostly represented in the room, I have to imagine that not only is it diversity of culture, but it's diversity of age that makes people feel like their particular values and positions aren't being represented. I really do. Whether it's correct in that you have to appeal to a big range of the population to get elected or not, I think an unintended consequence of the two-party system is creating apathy when you don't feel like either party represents truly what you value. So I do think that we have an obligation to create opportunities to hear from some of the smaller platforms. I think that we need to do that. And I think that if the last election is evidence, your generation, which is a humongous generation, is probably going to move the needle. Now, does it move the needle such that we have more than two parties in national elections? I don't know. But certainly at the primary level, maybe some of these third-party candidates will be getting more attention, and the substance of their platforms will be getting more attention. And I have a feeling that that can appeal to members of society who haven't felt like the two-party system was represented.
If we vote.
we're just about out of time. You've got one question. I don't carry all this.
Okay, really quickly. There does seem to be a historical precedent for placing value in the values of people. This isn't a direct
source that I read this from, but something that I've heard in class, that Washington and I think John Adams thought that the fall of the Republic of Rome was due to a degradation of the country's citizens. Just wanted to just sort of.
Good. We have anything else that we're going to end here in just a minute, but I would like to go back to the panel one more time. And if you have any concluding comments or if you would like to express anything.
Yeah, I would just conclude my remarks by saying that as an immigrant, I having traveled to more than 87 different countries, I can tell you for a fact that many people around this planet come to view of America as a great nation. Certainly the United States political culture, institutions, and innovative ideas have contributed to America's greatness. But again, my main concern is how much our policymakers in Washington are really looking after America's national interest. Are they putting their self-interest ahead of the nation's interest? That is the concern. And whether we are on a course of decline in certain areas, that is something that we need to pay attention to.
I stayed up last night watching a documentary about Jimi Hendrix and the creative process that went into making his very famous album Electric Ladyland. It culturally, it is, actually I've seen it before, I just watched it again. It's remarkable. What I think is amazing about America is you, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, you get the full complement, the full ability to just explore the human dynamic, right? It could be through drugs, it could be through music, it could be through, the sexual revolution, political revolt, whatever it is. But that idea of creativity and having that individualized freedom to create something. I once heard a quote from another guitarist. I'm very obviously into music, and Jeff Skunk Baxter, and he said, that guitar is a representation of the freedom of entire generations that were given the ability to create and think for themselves. And that's the romantic side of, and the important side for me of individualism and freedom. The responsibility that comes with that is just because you can, should you, right? I mean, and that's, I think, where we wrestle with, or what we should be wrestling with in a free society. Are you going to use your freedoms in a way that destroys the political culture out of either self-interest or irresponsibility or negligence? And I think what we have is this tension between the romanticized nature of individualism, right, and the destructive nature of individualism because we protect that freedom so much. There's a certain collective responsibility that Dr. Mosley talked about that I think we have lost just because legally we have the right to do things. Yeah. Now that's my closing thought.
Yeah, I would close with the phrase, we the people. America is supposed to be a nation that wants to hear from its people governs the rest of the people, and those people need to work for the people, and they need to start listening to each other, and they need to go back to compromise and getting things done. We like to, we're America, we get things done. Well, in Washington, it hasn't been like that very much lately. And I agree with Professor Andrus that there's this concept that many political philosophers have brought up, positive freedom. There's negative freedom, just freedom, government, leave me alone so I can do whatever I want to do. That's a negative freedom. Positive freedom is the freedom to do what you know is right, which has to do with what's good for the country. And I think we need to get back. We need to move the needle that way a little bit.
And I would just close. For the longest time, I've always felt that what made America great was we have these, and you can see them, it's reflected in your chart up here that you put. We have these amazing principles that we have developed values around in our Constitution. And those values, not all, but those values I believe in on a daily basis. And when we really can take those principles and make them our own values and exercise them, I think that's where our greatness lies. I was I picked up a little book. It was quotes by Abraham Lincoln, and it was really a good exercise for me because I've always read about him. But this was the man speaking on as a teacher, as letters he wrote, speeches he wrote, and everything. And you see he had such an amazing sense of appreciation for the dignity of all men. And one of the things that makes this great is what we did here today. We all came together, we sat down, and we said, let's talk this out, let's put this together, and let me look at my thinking. Let me see what other people are thinking. And I think that's what makes this great. So I want to applaud. Can we give an applause here for our marvelous, outstanding job? And I want to thank all of you for coming. It was terrific. Thank you.